En daarover zal dokter Mensel ons nu toespreken. De heer Mensel is de biograaf van Lodewijk XIV. Dat dikke boek van hem, 500 bladzijden, is in het Engels verkrijgbaar, in het Nederlands op dit moment niet. Maar ik kan het u zeer aanraden, omdat het op dit moment wel de laatste stand van zaken is van het onderzoek naar de tijd van Lodewijk XIV. And we are very pleased you are here, Dr. Mensel, and I would give you the floor, please. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for the wonderful invitation to a place very dear to my heart, where I feel I'm at a European location at an intersection of the Netherlands, England, Germany, and, as I hope to show later, France too. And I'm talking now about Louis XIV and diplomacy. And I hope to show two things. Europe is behind us as well as in front of us, or at least some of us. And diplomacy was really a key tool for Louis XIV as for other powers, and very often, as the ambassadors among you will be, I hope, glad to know, diplomats were infinitely more intelligent and more effective than generals. And I think that is a lesson for today. And I'm going to speak about, Louis XIV. Let's begin with Louis XIV. He was, in a way, a monster, a very cruel leader. As you will learn later, he destroying villages in the Netherlands, throwing out Protestants in a way so cruel you cannot not compare it to the persecutions of the 20th century. But he was also a global and European figure, at least as much as he was French. He was not stuck in Paris and Versailles. He traveled all over France, from Dunkirk to Marseille. And at his public dinner at Versailles, and this picture is 1778, it shows the four corners of the world, the four continents, America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, admiring the great king. And then his fame is being trumpeted by that beautiful lady on the left. And this picture is one of many pictures, the theme, the king, the four corners of the world, which he himself commissioned, and this hung in a public hospital in Paris. And Versailles was a global hub. He would listen to travelers' tales at his public dinner. Travelers would file past and he would talk to them about Aleppo or China or Louisiana or Canada. And he had a global view, France and Catholicism, mediated through monarchy. He spoke to the King of Siam as a fellow monarch, and he wrote very characteristically that Catholicism was the best and the truest religion, and what for him was the supreme argument. I quote from his letter, the one most likely to make subjects obedient to kings. So we have a sort of, today people talk about human rights around the world, then they talked about monarchy around the world. A very close connection, and again, he's the first king who had agents in Peking, in Beijing, missionaries and astronomers and mathematicians, highly intelligent French and Belgian Jesuits. And Père Bouvet, 1697, he wrote a portrait historique de l'empereur de la Chine, présenté au roi, and he called the emperor the Kangxi Emperor, a prince who, like you, sire, joins to a genius as sublime as it is solid, a heart even more worthy of the empire. The Emperor of China would be, and I quote, the most accomplished monarch who has reigned on the earth in a long time, if his reign did not coincide with that of your majesty. So, Emperor of China, King of France, and they really thought they would convert China to Catholicism because Confucianism was seen as a code of laws, not totally different from Christianity, but that was in fact destroyed by the Pope. But the French Jesuits were much more globally minded and adaptable and flexible. And there's a great French influence of map makers and interpreters and astronomers in Peking at the time. Now, so he's global, but he's also European. There he is. And that's another picture on the same theme, the king admired by the four corners of the world. And these magnificent globes of Louis XIV that you can see in the Bibliothèque Nationale, site Mitran. Now, well worth a visit. On the left is the celestial globe, on the right is the terrestrial globe dedicated to Louis XIV, with wonderful inscriptions, again, about his sublime genius and so on. There you see the king with this inscription. And this is the Escalier des Ambassadeurs in Versailles, which no longer exists. It was very characteristically pulled down by Louis XV to make room for a theatre for Madame de Pompadour. But in the great age of Louis XIV, it's a global power statement, because the ambassadors, and we'll come to that later, including the ambassadors from Siam, would go up this staircase, and the pictures on the walls would show, again, this theme of the four continents admiring Louis XIV. His bust is in the middle. And here is, he's a European figure. He's part of the family of kings, not just the Bourbons, kings of France, but through his mother and his wife, Anne of Austria. He's part of the Habsburgs, a really European force whose European impact hasn't, they're always seen as Austrian, but they were also European with a finger in every pie. And through his mother and his wife, this shows his interview with the King of Spain, Habsburg. He inherited a claim to the Spanish monarchy because both were infantas of Spain. The Spanish monarchy was a global monarchy stretching from Mexico, Spain, the southern Netherlands, half of Italy, and the Philippines, and perhaps very importantly, huge global commerce on which France had its eyes, including the slave trade from Africa to the Spanish colonies. And thanks to his efforts, as we'll see, his descendant, King Philip VI, is King of Spain today. So there's still a Bourbon on the throne because of Louis XIV. And by the way, in case I forget, he's these French ambassadors with whom he is personally corresponding, not just through his ministers. He deals with them in Sweden, in Constantinople, in Warsaw, in Regensburg, in Vienna, in Rome, everywhere. And one great phenomenon of the time is the rise of Russia. Even before Peter the Great, his father was expanding and took Kiev in 1667. It's a very present, the issues of today were present then. France was an ally of Sweden. Catholic France with Lutheran Sweden. It was an alliance since the days of Richelieu, and France and Louis XIV was loyal to it, as indeed all French monarchs were until the Napoleonic Wars. He supported Charles XII of Sweden in his campaign to, which not many people refer to in present discussions, to take Ukraine and to free Poland from Russian influence, 1707, 1709. It ended in the catastrophic Swedish defeat at Poltava in 1709. The end of Sweden as a great power, really. Sweden, France's ally. And Louis XIV dismissed Russia as barbarians, I quote. He used the word barbarians. And he refused. William III received Peter the Great, hugged him, had him to stay in Amsterdam, in London. Louis XIV refused to receive him as a barbarian. But in my opinion, Louis XIV was just as barbarian as any ruler of Russia. And these personal letters to ambassadors and from ambassadors really distinguish him as from preceding and subsequent French monarchs. He's really a very hard worker. He's not going to parties at Versailles every night. He's working late at night in his office or the flat of Madame de Maintenon, often till midnight. And one of his great projects was 1672, the attack on the Netherlands. And showing unusual caution, he does it in alliance with England. England was then very much a European power, at the heart of Europe. And this is the Duke of Savoy, a first cousin of Louis XIV, to show again he's part of the family of kings. And on the right, a French princess, Marie-Jeanne Baptiste de Savoie de Nemours, who is in fact an agent of Louis XIV at the court of Turin, making sure that it is a French ally and that French regiments can be stationed there and that Savoy regiments will fight in the French army. And another first cousin of Louis XIV is, there he is, ambassadors, highly important as symbols of sovereigns. Here he is receiving the apologies of the ambassador of the King of Spain in 1662, the Count of Fuente, because the Spanish ambassador had dared try and go before the coach of the French ambassador in the streets of London in 1661, and there was in fact a battle. The two ambassadors had prepared their footmen to fight. They'd lined their coach wheels with iron so they couldn't be sabotaged. The London crowd supports the Spanish ambassador against the French ambassador. It's a terrific thing, and some people die, and in the end the Spanish ambassador has to admit that henceforth everywhere, in every court, the French ambassador will take precedence over the Spanish ambassador. These carriage wars and embassy wars are very important prestige issues, like various issues today of human rights. Then it is prestige. And there was a famous incident in the Lange Voorhout in The Hague in 1664, I think, when the French ambassador's carriage meets the Prince of Orange's carriage. And guess who has to get out and let the other carriage go first? It's the Prince of Orange. He's publicly humiliated on the advice of the estates and his grandmother and so on. But believe me, he got his revenge later. So, as revenge is a dish best eaten cold. And here again, the papal legate is apologizing to Louis XIV for another incident with another ambassador in Rome to do with the French ambassador's Corsican guards. And again, Louis XIV won his prestige war. This is a Gobelins tapestry. Many magnificent Gobelins tapestries recorded the triumphs of the king and were then given as presents to foreign monarchs or ambassadors. And he is a prestige person. He believes in the divine right of kings, but above all, he's a military monarch. He believes in the divine right of weapons and guns. And this is an inscription on the cannon in the courtyard of the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris. The last argument of kings, ultima ratio regum. He believed that in the end, battles were what mattered. And this was, I think, one of his chief delusions, because he lost so many battles. And 1672, yes, this is a medal one of the many medals that he commissioned to celebrate his victories. This is the restoration of military discipline to show what a great military monarch he was. And one of his enemies was the great Dutch diplomat Conrad van Beuningen, and there was a medal war of prestige between the Netherlands and France. In 1668, the Netherlands issued medals which Louis XIV interpreted as humiliating him, because they presented the Netherlands as the state which, and I quote, reconciled kings, restored the freedom of the seas, brought about peace by force of arms, and re-established the repose of Europe. Now, Louis XIV could not tolerate that another power would dare to present itself as a leading power in Europe. And medals recur in peace terms, as I will show. And here, to show you the expansion of France under Louis XIV, he's advancing northeast towards the Netherlands, east into Alsace and Franche-Comté, and south into Roussillon. It's a great military power with an army of about 250,000 men, at least in theory, at its height. It's getting bigger, personally trained by the king every year after 1661. He spends a lot of time not just in palaces, but in military camps, often drilling the soldiers himself, often being in the trenches himself. And the army is getting bigger, and all Europe is looking towards it after 1670. Here you see him entering Arras, one of the many Low Countries towns. He had, in fact, inherited that, but he's taking possession. He personally bothers to go into each city with his wife, his guards, his court, public Catholic masses, public dining in state. He's very much a hands-on monarch. Here he is at Courtrai. This is a short war with Spain. And here is one of his agents. You saw the Duchess of Savoy, who is a French agent. This is the Duchess of Orléans, who is a French agent, also an English agent. She's the sister of Charles II, the first cousin and sister-in-law of Louis XIV. And he, more than any monarch, is using women in diplomacy to advance French power. And she, highly intelligent, adored by the court because she's much more relaxed and charming than the Queen, and she negotiates the secret Treaty of Dover in 1670. The terms were for Charles II to declare himself a Catholic, for Charles II to improve the legal position of Catholics in England, and above all, for both France and England to attack the Netherlands. They both wanted a piece of the Dutch cake. They wanted to destroy Dutch trade. They were jealous and envious. Sir William Temple, the British ambassador in the Netherlands, called the Netherlands superior in everything to England except in envy. And the subsidy and the letters between Charles II and his sister are very modern. They're really businessmen negotiating for a deal between France and England. He agrees to become an ally of Louis XIV, and I quote from them, "But I must have my account in it, as he must have his," that is the King of France, his account being taking all the Spanish colonies and all the Dutch colonies, including New York. It's then that New Amsterdam becomes New York. And there's a wonderful throwaway line in Charles II's letters. He says, "And I think this port may be very advantageous for trade." So they're thinking ahead. These two divine right monarchs are also very unscrupulous and enterprising merchants personally interested in and profiting from trade. Louis XIV also loved war to satisfy his nobility. The Savoy ambassador, for example, wrote that the king went to war to amuse all the young men of the court. The courtiers were interested in the prospect of war, and I quote, which everyone desires. As a war-hungry young court, the king almost has to go to war to keep them quiet and to stop them from making war on him in France itself. And Conrad van Beuningen, who had been a successful Dutch ambassador, becomes hated by the king and almost a cause of the war. Louis XIV's personal memoir on the campaign of 1672 in the War Archives at Vincennes talks about, I'm sorry to have to say this, the ingratitude, ignorance, and insupportable arrogance of the Netherlands. Cette altière et ingrate nation, this haughty and ungrateful nation. Because Louis XIV had the feeling that France and the Bourbons had helped the Dutch in the War of Independence against Spain. And he talks openly about, I quote, my desire to revenge myself for the insult I had received from the Dutch. Really an imaginary insult, about 1 or 2 medals. His feelings, he claimed, were understandable in a young monarch well treated by fortune and wars. Moreover, he needed to maintain the glory and the reputation of my kingdom. So vanity, then as now, was one of the causes of events, one of the springboards of events. And he's doing this training of his army. It's really primed for battle. He would review his troops, lead them all lusty, well-horsed and well-clad up. He would lead his wife up and down the lines to review them, and particularly keen on his military household, the Garde du Corps, the Maison Militaire du Roi, which is what Louis XIV himself created. The Savoy ambassador wrote, never have you seen so much regularity and discipline, and never has an army been so well regulated. The Dutch ambassador, Peter de Groot, 22nd of January 1672, wrote of the certitude of a very violent war. Everybody knew war was coming. We will need all the favor which God has so often shown us on such occasions. The king wants at any price whatever to become master of the Low Countries, and the Dutch ambassador blamed England as the sole cause of all the evil, that England was encouraging French aggression and had made a deal to profit from it. And this English alliance is very important to Louis XIV. At times, wrote one English ambassador who saw Louis XIV, his expressions of friendship for Charles II were, and I quote, more passionate than I ever heard from any man in my whole life. In good earnest, I do hardly see how he can say much more to his mistress. And he did have another woman as an agent. The Duchesse d'Orléans died in 1670, having negotiated the treaty. But Louise de Keroualle was a fille d'honneur of the Duchesse d'Orléans. Charles II fell in love with her. She goes to England. She moves easily between the courts, as many people did in those days. She becomes a lady-in-waiting of Charles II's queen, mistress-in-chief, Duchess of Portsmouth in England, and Duchesse d'Aubigny in France. So the only woman who's been made a duchess in her own right in 2 kingdoms, because she worked very hard for it. She is mistress of Charles II, which can't have been a great joke, and she's often crossing the channel, and she's corresponding directly with Louis XIV, how to keep Charles II as a loyal ally. And you see that she is lifting the hem of her robe, and the African servant is holding pearls and coral, which I think are symbols of the sea, of maritime power. If anybody knows better, please tell me. And she's holding up the hem of her robe to reveal a stool. That is the tabouret on which duchesses were allowed to sit at formal ceremonies at the French court. A very hard-won stool, but it's in the picture because it was so important as a sign of prestige in the French court. And it seems ridiculous maybe now, but it was a great honor to be allowed to sit in front of the Queen. And at the English court, at formal ceremonies, you had to stand always until the reign of Queen Victoria, at least. And she's a very important power broker, and it was said that it was her lavishly decorated apartment in Whitehall Palace, Gobelins tapestries, French furniture, presents from Louis XIV. That was the real center of power under Charles II, not a meeting of ministers. That's where the ministers went to see the king and get things done. And he also had another brilliant ambassador, informal ambassador, a member of a prominent South German dynasty called Wilhelm Egon von Fürstenberg, a friend of the foreign minister, Leon, and he had a written contract to further all the plans and interests of His Majesty. He's the agent softening up the German princes, spreading bribes, and making sure that southern and western Germany was, in those days, pro-French. And on the 4th of May, 1672, he writes to Colbert, "I find a great part of the troops in the best state of the world. I hope they will soon make themselves and me talked about." And that's really one of the great aims of this war. It wasn't just for Dutch territory, it's also to be talked about, to be publicized, to reach all four corners of the world, which indeed it did. And it's very professional. It begins well. They storm up through Liège and then up the Rhine and approaching Utrecht from the east. The Savoy ambassador says, "The king is constantly on horseback. He takes great care that his army lives and marches in order. He keeps an eye on everything. He does not rush." And one would say that he no longer gives a thought to the beauties he has left in Paris. That is his mistress, Madame de Montespan. He always has the map of the region to hand and speaks to all the officers, never listens to everyone, and gives orders without consulting anyone. And this is Rampjaar. As I'm sure you know, the stocks in the Dutch East India companies so collapsed. Some merchants moved their business from Amsterdam to Hamburg for safety. There's little Dutch resistance. 23rd of June, Godard van Ginkel writes to his father, "Our whole country, for which our forefathers fought for 80 years, is on the brink of being lost without even having strongly resisted the enemy." It's a complete collapse, and Utrecht admits the French army without resistance, having refused to admit the young Prince of Orange and his troops. So nationalism isn't as strong as fear or realism. And by the way, William of Prince of Orange is first cousin, once removed, of Louis XIV through his mother, Mary, who is a daughter of Henrietta Maria and Louis XIV's first cousin, and whom in fact he knew. And at the beginning, the Prince of Orange was rather a protege of Louis XIV. Louis XIV stays at a succession of Dutch houses, including Amerongen, and he arrives outside Utrecht on the 1st of July, but revealingly, he doesn't really want to go inside Utrecht because he's frightened of bombs or explosions. His homosexual brother, Monsieur, goes inside and has a party, but Louis XIV does eventually ride into Utrecht through streets lined with his own bodyguards, but he did not dismount, nor did he enter the cathedral, which French troops had just restored to Catholicism. One boy cried, "Vive le prince," nobody cried, "Vive le roi." And he stays outside Utrecht in a camp, a beautiful French royal camp at Zeist, all prepared for him by his Maréchal Général des Logis, camps like small cities with their own hospitals, rows of tents, and the city librarian Everard Booth rode out, and he noticed that the king's bedroom in his tent becomes, according to French court etiquette, la chambre du roi, and you had to take off your hat when you pass Louis XIV's bed. And he also noted that even the king had even brought his pet dogs with him, so he felt at home outside Utrecht. And it all looks very magnificent, but in fact, as you know, the French did not capture control of the Dutch water defenses. They did not keep Muiden, which the Comte d'Estrades had advised them to take, because he understood dikes, the Comte d'Estrades, who had been French ambassador in The Hague. There is a vast lake is put between Zeeland and Holland, and Louis XIV was cheated of his prize. And many observers then said, if the Prince de Condé, a proper general, had been in charge, the French would have been in Amsterdam. But as the king, who preferred slow, careful advances and grand entries into cities, was in charge, they were cheated. Dutch negotiators offer very good terms on the 26th of June, including Maastricht and northern Brabant for France, but they're refused. He holds out, he wanted Utrecht, Limburg, Gelders, Overijssel, and Groningen. And above all, Louis XIV's aggression creates what he most fears, a strong Dutch authority, i.e. William III, Prince of Orange, who as a result of Louis's invasion becomes stadtholder in 5 provinces and Admiral General and Captain General of Dutch forces. And there's a famous remark, the Duke of Buckingham, an English courtier, the English are attacking by the sea, and also they've sent troops in the French army, the Regiment Royal Anglais, and the Duke of Buckingham asks William, surely you see that everything is lost. And William replies in a famous phrase, my lord, my country is indeed in danger, but there is one way never to see it lost, and that is to die in the last ditch. And Van Beuningen, who by now is Louis XIV's personal enemy, becomes a member of Amsterdam City Council and is a great defender of Dutch rights. And in fact, Louis is thwarted and really mastered by William Van Beuningen and Liesela, who you mentioned earlier. Here is Jan de Witt, who is really pro-French. We must always remember the other side of the story. This great Grand Pensionary and Dutch figure was even negotiating with French diplomats in 1672. He's more alarmed by the power of the House of Orange than by Louis XIV's power. Like many other Dutch merchants and people in Amsterdam, they preferred peace and trade with France to perpetual wars, and he is murdered in circumstances I'm sure you know, and clearly William III had organized it, and some of the murderers were later pensioned. Here is the passage of the Rhine, much memorialized by French painters. And here is him, Louis XIV, being offered the keys of Utrecht. And the war goes on. Louis XIV had been known for his mercy and mildness, but by 1672, there is a reign of terror where French troops are dominating the Dutch countryside. I quote the Maréchal de Luxembourg, the great French general, writing to Louvois, Louis XIV's Minister of War, a real brute who will later organize the devastation of the Rhineland in 1688, which again helps turn European opinion against Louis XIV. Luxembourg writes, "I dare not tell you what excesses pillaging has reached." And later, brutal methods which repeatedly led precisely to the result he was seeking to avert. So it reminds us of events this year in Ukraine. All the Dutch who were in the village were grilled alive. This is Louvois, the Minister of War, speaking. Not one was allowed to leave their houses. Other villages also suffered, and these atrocities were publicized by the very excellent Dutch publicity machine in Amsterdam, The Mirror of French Tyranny, published by Romain de Hague with prints. And by the way, the Dutch army also massacred and plundered civilians, and Ginkel wrote of many atrocities in the electorate of Cologne, which was then allied to France. But Dutch publicity was better than French publicity. And these massacres, this war went on. 1673, he is outside Maastricht. This is the first major siege organized by Vauban, his great engineer and siege master who built a phalanx of forts all around France in the reign of Louis XIV. A very down-to-earth, very realistic man, the only advisor who dared say the Protestants should be recalled to France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Whether that letter to Louis XIV was actually received or even sent isn't certain. Anyway, Vauban organizes the siege of Maastricht. Again, there's a splendid tent village. You can't see it there. Louis XIV is on horseback. One of his guards is in red in front of him. It's all very elegant and very well arranged. And there is the Quartier du Roi, the Quartier de Monsieur, the Quartier des Ministres, and the Quartier de Monsieur de Monmouth, because there are still English forces supporting the French attack, and Monmouth is the favorite illegitimate son of Charles II, who is then fighting with the French army. And guess who is with him in the French army? It is John Churchill, later Duke of Marlborough. He begins in the French army and he learns some of his tactics and strategy from the French. There is Louis XIV as a Roman hero in front of Maastricht, and he's blessed by victory, crowning him with laurels. That is how he wanted to be seen. He's living in the past, not a French royal past, but a Roman classical past. He's a new Roman emperor and represented as such frequently. And the idea was that Versailles was a new Roman imperial palace, better than the old one and better than Roman Renaissance palaces. It was built for the world and for Europe as much as for France. And here is the Duke of Monmouth, painted by Gascard, a French painter. When he's serving in the French army, you see the magnificent costume, rather in the French style. He knew Versailles and Louis XIV well. He's commander of the Life Guards, and he's a very different person then than later he becomes the Protestant Duke and friend of William III. And indeed, on the 3rd of July, 1673, after only 3 weeks, as Vauban had predicted, Louis XIV made a formal entry into Maastricht, one of the strongest forts in the Netherlands. And we mustn't forget the personal factor, the vanity of Louis XIV, one of the factors in the war. This is Charles II as an ally of Louis XIV, He's presented as Neptune, god of the sea, attacking the Dutch by sea as Louis attacks by land, a coordinated Anglo-French multi-force amphibious operation. But the Dutch win various naval victories. The English complain about the French fleet, and so in 1674, Charles II, who is never reliable for anybody or anything, makes peace with the Dutch. But this picture is still in the Royal Collection in England now. There he is before Besançon, expanding east, taking Franche-Comté, which has remained French ever since. Here he is presented again as a Roman emperor, receiving the keys of conquered cities. And on the right, he's Hercules, and underneath is a figure thought to represent the Netherlands, groaning in submission. And this is the Comte d'Estrades, a very brilliant French ambassador, wiser than the king, who had been ambassador in the Netherlands. He'd helped make the Treaty of Westphalia. It's he whose carriage William of Orange had to give way to in 1664, and he finally makes peace in 1678 at this treaty, the Treaty of Nimwegen. Again, it's a picture by Henri Gascard. I think it's in Nimwegen. I'm sorry, I can't identify all the figures in the picture, but the man holding the quill on the left is the Comte d'Estrades, the chief French negotiator. This is the height of Louis XIV's power. He's taken an awful lot of the Spanish Netherlands and Alsace. And William has been defeated. William is just as warlike, if not more so, than Louis XIV. He actually attacks the French army 4 days after peace had been signed. He knew that peace had been signed, but he still went on. At the end, battle ended with much slaughter and no clear victor. And here he is before Strasbourg. After the peace, the expansion and the onslaught of France continues. This time he's using more peaceful methods. Really, the terror of his army, the terror of the behavior in the Netherlands, forced Strasbourg and other Alsace cities to submit without a fight. And for once he shows himself a statesman. He at once intimidation and seduction, and he guarantees to keep all the rights and traditions of Strasbourg. There he is before the city of Strasbourg, 20,000 people, one of the richest cities in the Holy Roman Empire, then German-speaking. It submits without a fight to Louis XIV. Yet again, town officials are handing the keys of their city on their knees to the triumphant Louis XIV, who doesn't bother to get out of his carriage. And there is even a plan for French expansion further into Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. I quote from a letter from a French diplomat. The ecclesiastical princes who are continually anxious and oppressed, altogether, it seems to me, would not abhor the sovereignty of your majesty if they were assured that they could keep under their domination the same privileges that they possess under the empire, and that they should not fear that after some time their subjects would be charged with taille, the worst French tax, and other taxes, with the result that they could no longer draw anything from them themselves. In other words, privileges and tax rates were more important than national feeling. And there was definitely a French plan to expand up the Rhine, even beyond the Rhine, to take, in my opinion, the electorate of Cologne, of Trier, maybe of Mainz also. The Archbishop Elector of Mainz told a French diplomat that he preferred the King of France as his neighbor to German Protestants. I mean, everybody was in fact going towards the rising sun. And the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna was prepared to accept almost anything as long as the king did not cross the Rhine. And he's also maintaining alliances with Switzerland near Strasbourg. He receives 23 ambassadors of the Swiss cantons in 1681 and replies to the respectful speeches, "Seeing you in such good intentions, I am more than ever determined to maintain the alliance and the treaties which have for so long been concluded between France and the Swiss." And when he enters Strasbourg, 23rd of October, gun salutes, all the ladies of the court, including Madame de Montespan and Madame de Maintenon, garde du corps, mousquetaires, church bells rang, the cathedral switches from Lutheranism to Catholicism, a great assembly of German princes, including the rulers of Baden and Württemberg, and the Bishop of Strasbourg, in a famous sermon, said now he could depart in peace because he had seen the man, which is a reference to Simeon's remark in the New Testament that now he could depart in peace because he has seen Jesus Christ, i.e. Louis XIV is openly compared to Jesus Christ. And really, because he treats Alsace and other provinces with relative respect, keeping their privileges, not trying to make them French, allowing them to go on using German in documents and German university at Strasbourg. Therefore, in my opinion, it's much more of a success than more brutal campaigns. And under Louis XIV, Alsace and Strasbourg maintain a treble identity, French, German, and Alsatian. This was another diplomatic triumph. The Doge of Genoa. Genoa has just been bombarded without a declaration of war by the French Navy, and he goes to Versailles, 1685. He actually apologizes to Louis XIV for the French bombardment of his own city. Even that is turned into an occasion for Louis XIV to parade his triumph. But atrocious as French behavior had been, the Genoese are treated very well at Versailles, honored guests, fireworks, parties, and so on. There's no humiliation through manners as there would be later in 20th century treaties. It's more subtle. Now back to the global triumph. This is 1685. 1686. Who comes to Versailles and goes up the Escalier des Ambassadeurs? The ambassadors of the King of Siam, Phra Narai, 1st of September. They bow almost to the floor in front of the king. And by the way, to show you the nature of Louis XIV's court, he himself had to make a way with his cane for the ambassadors through the crowd of courtiers in the Galerie des Glaces. They were so disobedient and so numerous that they wouldn't make a way themselves. The king had to do it himself. Here they are bringing the presence of the King of Siam. They've traveled for 2 years, 2,000 miles, just to go to Versailles. And here they are in front of the king, kowtowing. And Louis XIV was told, I quote one traveler, "It seems to me that all the kings of Asia and Africa will one day be your tributaries, and that you are destined to command the entire universe." And that was the intention. He sent 1,000 troops to Siam, 1688. But again, this provokes a reaction. There is a sort of nationalist revolt, encouraged possibly by 5 minutes. By Dutch agents, and they're thrown out, and French influence comes to an end for 200 years. Now, I'm going to go through some slides. Again, there's a brilliant French ambassador in Holland, the Comte d'Avaux. There they are again, the Siamese. William's embarkation for England. The Comte d'Avaux warns Louis XIV. He warns Louis XIV not to cut trade, not to persecute Protestants, not to force Dutch prisoners in France to convert to Catholicism. Many pinpricks by Louis XIV, but he can't stop himself. He's now literally drunk with power, in my opinion. And he's so keen on supporting the Ottoman Empire, which is under attack from Austria, that he invades Germany in the autumn of 1688 as a diversion to draw Austrian troops away from the Ottoman Empire, leaving the field open for William to invade England. And there's a real French-Ottoman alliance. I'll be showing that later, I hope. And French ambassadors in Constantinople are truly important major figures in world diplomacy. A brilliant success by William. He gets the throne of England practically without a shot being fired in anger. Everything is very well prepared. Here he is on his horse by Nella, looking slightly like Louis XIV in other portraits. The two cousins resembled each other in many tastes. The Duke of Schomberg, the reception of James II by Louis XIV, his first cousin. As a result, there is now another government near Versailles, Saint-Germain, with its own diplomats, army, even navy, the Jacobite government in exile. And here is the great Ginkel, who, having been a Dutch general fighting Louis XIV, he is now, in addition, a British general, commander-in-chief of Their Majesty's forces, that is William and Mary, in Ireland, and he wins the Battle of the Boyne, 1690. Another very important conflict, which is still a national holiday today in Northern Ireland. This is the foundation of Protestant supremacy in Ireland, and what is called to this day Orangism. There is not only oranges in the Netherlands, but in Ulster, even more passionate perhaps, and they take it very seriously indeed. Louis XIV didn't listen to his ambassador in the Netherlands. That is the King of Poland, another French queen, Marie de la Grange d'Arquia. She's wife of John Sobieski. She's another female agent of Louis XIV's diplomacy in Poland. And Louis XIV is concerned to maintain Poland as a barrier against Russian and Prussian and Austrian expansion. He's already thinking ahead. That is his ambassador to Poland, Melchior de Polignac, who buys votes for a French prince to become King of Poland. If a French prince had established a dynasty, maybe Poland wouldn't have been divided and have remained a strong country, but it remained an elective monarchy and was in the end eliminated. That is the French prince who went to Danzig, but he couldn't land because the Elector of Saxony had already spent more money and had more troops to hand, and he had frightened and bought the votes of the Poles. Here is the Comte d'Avaux, who had warned Louis XIV about Dutch plans. He knew everything that was going on in the Netherlands. Very close relations with Amsterdam merchants who preferred French power to Orange power, but he wasn't listening to them. The great Bentinck, Earl of Portland, who is William's ambassador during a brief period of peace in 1697 to 98. Wonderful dispatches, and they're very civilized. It's these two kings who hated each other also shared a taste for plants. And a lot of Bentinck's letters to Your Majesty, William III, they're all about the quality of the orange trees or the tulips in Versailles. And he says, oh, but compared to those of Your Majesty, the King of France has nothing. And he's very much a favorite of Louis XIV on the surface, but it's really only on the surface. And in his heart of hearts, Louis XIV prefers James II and recognizes his son as King of England. Here is Europe at this time. You see the size of Poland, Lithuania, which Louis XIV tried to maintain, the size of the Ottoman Empire, which Louis' ambassadors are advising militarily and navally, and where French trade is highly important. The expansion of France east. 1700, the declaration of his grandson as King of Spain in Versailles, and his speech shows some of the forces at work in Europe then. Be a good Spaniard. It is now your first duty, i.e. monarchs have duties. But remember that you are born French. To maintain union between the two nations, it is the way of making them happy and of preserving peace in Europe. So peace in Europe is a real aim of Louis XIV. There is a terrible war, but I would like to conclude. Yes, okay. I'll just conclude with what they said in the Treaty of Utrecht. Utrecht is the diplomatic capital of Europe, 1712 to 13. The British are very much there. In the end, a treaty is signed, and many references to the peace of Europe in Prince, public diplomacy again. England is shown as, and I quote, the protector of Europe. Prince showed an Englishman, a Frenchman, a Dutchman, a Spaniard, a German, and a Savoyard dancing le farandole européen. And some diplomats already dreamt of a European army and a European assembly, with a European Senate in Utrecht. And Callière, one of Louis' secretaries, would later write a manifesto for Europe. So Europe is very much a reality as well as an idea. All the states of which Europe is composed have between them necessary liaisons and connections, which mean that one can regard them as members of one same republic, that is, political body. And it is almost impossible for a considerable change to take place in any of its members without it troubling the repose of all the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lamal, for your wonderful overview of this period and your beautiful illustrations as well. And interesting that your story starts in Amerongen and ends in Utrecht, this European story. So you're very well known with our history, and thank you very much for that. And now I would like to ask if there are questions as well to Ms. Lamal and to Mr. Menzel. I think we have about 15 minutes. I'm looking, about 10-15 minutes for questions, and I would like to ask who will be the first. Can you please mention your name, and there will be a micro.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question to Nina Lamal, because in our great exposition we have enhanced pamphlets, but they are drawings. Would you consider that also as public diplomacy? And the other question is, who would buy those manuscripts which are not easy to read by the public maybe then, instead of these drawings which are easier to comprehend?
May I invite you to come here, then everybody can see you. Yes.
So I'll answer in English as well. So I was thinking when I saw your beautiful pictures, I'd forgotten to include some prints that they make of ambassadors, showing all the different ambassadors, not in paintings, but in cheap print during peace negotiations, for instance. So giving a face also to these diplomats negotiating. And indeed, a lot of these, for instance, Romain de Hoge is, of course, the chief propagandist of William. So yes, we do consider a lot of these images and prints as part of diplomatic campaigns, but they serve a different purpose. And in a sense, a lot of these printed but also manuscript texts are also directed to their direct peers. So diplomats trying to influence other diplomats, letting other people, politicians, and especially in the Dutch Republic, know what everyone was talking about. So there is of course, there are different layers within the public, and it depends on what type of pamphlet that they put out, that they were trying to think about that. And we're looking at these letters, and we find that they really discussed how to do this. So a very popular genre was a letter from a friend to another friend. And it's very popular in the Dutch Republic. So a lot of English diplomats, for instance, advise one another to do the same, because then it sells well, your name is not on it, no one knows it. So it's these type of praatjespamfletten that ambassadors start to mimic, because it pretends to be from the people, but it's actually written by them as well. So there is a whole game going on, which is very interesting. I hope I answer your question. Blijven wij hier staan?
De volgende vraag, next question. Over hier, Lodewijk, ja.
Hello. I'm interested in the effect of the speeches to the public, because nowadays you can research the social media and the effects of the social media. You got data. So how did it affect the public? Did they mobilize the public to do things? I don't know if I'm clear enough.
Yeah, we have instances where pamphlets are published and people storm buildings, for instance. So there is sometimes a direct relation between print and public reaction. But you know what, people really thought we need to look at diaries and how they respond to certain things they've read. And that's, of course, a lot. Yeah, it's another genre that we need to look at to measure responses. But yeah, there clearly is an influence, but not as easy to measure as with Twitter nowadays, I would say. Yeah.
So you didn't, there isn't much information about it? It's like being, like articles in newspapers?
Well, I would say public opinion nowadays is as elusive as it was then, because we think we have a grip on it by looking at Twitter, doing opinion polls, but it's still, I think, something that is very difficult to grapple with. A lot of sociologists also say it's very difficult, but for us it's even more elusive, and we try to trace things in diaries to see how people reacted and responded, but of course that only gives you the layer of society that keeps a diary, is able to write, is able to buy them and read them. So for us, the public is much more difficult to find. We do our best with the material we have, and there are traces, but it's painstaking and a lot of work, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Ja, hier een vraag, Lodewijk.
This is a question for Dr. Mansell. Could you, thank you very much for your very interesting expose. Could you perhaps expound just a little bit on the public mood which prevailed in France during the last years of the reign of Louis XIV? Because I remember that when I went to French secondary schools, our teachers told us that the public mood in France at the very beginning of the 18th century was rather despondent. France as an exhausted country, Louis XIV having gone too far, there was a general pessimism, a gloomy atmosphere in general. And would that be in contrast to the earlier, much more glorious period which you described to us?
Yes, I agree completely. unfortunately, I had to rush the end of my talk. By 1709, there are bread riots. Madame de Maintenon, who is always gloomy, her letters are brilliant. She knows about lack of bread in Normandy or Languedoc, and she says, the younger generation will face things that will require much more leadership than is required now. I mean, she feels a revolution is coming. She'd known the Fronde. And there's a famous poem, 1709, circulating, but we don't know exactly how much. The grandfather is a boaster. The son is an idiot, that's the Dauphin. The grandson, the Duc de Bourgogne, he's a big coward. He'd run away from the Battle of Oudenarde, or was thought to have. Frenchmen, I pity you. Why don't you do what they did in England? That's enough from me. That's enough to be said. And if the Garde Française in 1709, when there were bread riots in Paris, hadn't been extremely well led and extremely loyal, and Louis XIV had kept back some of the guards from fighting the Dutch and the English to protect his throne, then things might have been very different. There might have been a revolution. But there's no great leader against him. The upper classes are on side with the King of France. He's bought them, basically. So things remain under his authority. But it is gloomy, and it is... Marlborough does penetrate the French lines of the Maréchal de Villars, the last great general, but he is saved by diplomacy again, in that there's a secret French agent, the Abbé Gautier, in London. He's in touch with the new Tory government under Harley. Half of England is fed up with the war, and they realize that Philip V in Spain and Louis XIV in France are far tougher than they thought. Marlborough had dreamt of summoning the Estates General in Paris, but it was a non-starter. There are secret negotiations run by the Abbé Gautier, who's working for France, England, and James III. And this leads to the treaty between France and England, while England is still officially allied to the Netherlands and the Emperor. And this is the origin of the phrase perfide Albion. But and this treaty leads to the Treaty of Utrecht, and the very brilliant French foreign minister, Torcy, who is a nephew of Colbert, and he arrives in Versailles with the news that a treaty has been signed in Utrecht, and he's received like a messiah. They do feel they've been saved from a terrible fate, that there are bread riots, starvation, famine, rivers frozen over, and so on. Only Orléans, as a regent, really saves the French monarchy. He's the cleverest of all the Bourbons, perhaps.
Thank you, Dr. Mansell. I have a brief question. You were talking about Jan de Witt. Do you believe, or do you think there is a reason to believe that the republicanism, which was still prevalent in Holland in the 17th century, has sort of been extinguished by the events of the calamity year?
No, I think it's always bubbling underneath. I think it's quite a divided society, like France and England were divided. And the reports of Davos show he's seeing a lot of Amsterdam merchants, regents, who want trade, who put trade with France before the defense of the Netherlands, in effect. And they think William is a war-hungry, possible despot. And who knows what would have happened if William had had a son and heir and successor, and in fact have been in a much stronger position. And then in the end, republicanism disappears in 1813, 1814.
Thank you.
elaborating on the last question, what would have been the consequences for the Netherlands if there wasn't a change in regime by the Prince? And secondly, isn't there a remarkable analogy in the policy of reunion with the policies of Vladimir Putin?
So, I couldn't quite hear that. Could you repeat, please?
The first was, what would have been the result if there wasn't a regime change in the Netherlands or in the Republic in 1672? And second, isn't there an analogy between the policies of reunion and the policies of Vladimir Putin?
I think there is an analogy between Louis XIV and Putin, these terror methods. I've spared you some of the details, how Dutch villages were treated, and being counterproductive, uniting the whole of Europe. He inherited a brilliant diplomatic situation in 1661 from Mazarin, France friends with everybody, and when he died, France had no friends, almost. And that is the la manière forte, that is what results. And also the devastation of the Rhineland is just as bad as of the Netherlands. And I also thought of what happened in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s. And if there had been no William III in 1672, there would have been a terrible peace, and the Netherlands would have lost some territory in the east, which Louis XIV the plan was to bargain it for more territory out of the southern Netherlands. There would have been a pliant Dutch Republic with a lot of Amsterdam merchants making more money from trade with France, I think.
Can I ask Dr. Lamel if she thinks, to which degree we should credit the French with sort of fomenting Holland's resistance to continuing the war, which eventually led to signing a separate peace treaty between the Dutch and the French without the Spanish and the Imperials?
So your question is how much we can credit the French in fermenting breaking the alliance with England. Yeah. I might be biased, but I think this is part of what Lisola is doing, and I would credit a lot of the ambassadors rather than the French, because these have always been uneasy alliances. And what they do is they target a lot of the people, a lot of the English parliamentarians, rather than the king himself. But you might have a different view on this, so I feel a bit, we'll see. I think there is a lot to say for a few diplomats who had a very keen sense of what they had to do, and they knew it already before the French attacked the Dutch Republic. It was clear to see when he invaded the southern Netherlands what his plan was. And I think from that moment in time, a lot of diplomats would try to tell this to Johan de Witt, who wasn't really listening. And this created a lot of problems. So there are people who were telling this, but they stepped up their game as well in publishing it to get their goal in a way, but it still took a lot of time. So I don't think I would credit the French, because invading is, I mean, it's not an easy option, but it's just a brutal way of then trying to achieve your goal. So I would credit the diplomats, but that's my point.
Please, maybe you have a different opinion. That's interesting.
I think the diplomats are vitally important. And Lisola is a key figure. People are working on him. And about the impact of pamphlets and so on. His pamphlet about, what was it called? Yep. His pamphlet on the Le Bouclier, or the shield, it was translated into English, Dutch, German, I mean, almost every language. A huge impact, a highly intelligent figure. And the ambassadors are often making policy as much as the home government. For example, Polignac in Poland is going much further than Louis XIV had instructed him, and they are really independent, semi-independent operators on it. And the French ambassador in Spain before 1700, the Duc d'Harcourt, helps get Spanish opinion pro-Bourbon and anti-Habsburg by, again, manipulation of public opinion or elite opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking around over here. Lodewijk?
Yeah, I have one question for the both of you. So we've talked about atrocity prints and books, and I was just wondering if, I know Louis complained in 1713 at the peace negotiations about the book French Tyranny, and I was wondering if he ever complained earlier on, so in 1673 or 1674, about atrocity prints or books.
About?
Atrocity prints or books, so the books by Abraham de Viquefort and the prints by Romein de Hoge, if he ever complained in 1674 or 1675.
About Dutch atrocities?
No, the atrocities in the villages Bodegraven and Zwammerdam. So I was wondering if he ever complained about it, about the prints.
No, I couldn't quite hear. About the prints. Yes, they did, and they had counterprints. And I think Romain de Hoog occasionally worked for the French. They did have counterprints. They complained about mocking medals. Sometimes they said that it was beneath the dignity of His Majesty to reply to such outrageous attacks. But sometimes they did, and I think even the king had some of these medals and prints against him in his collections. I think the French ambassadors in London and The Hague were very keen on countering attacks, and they would even try and lure Huguenots back to France. But the evidence of the facts of their treatment stopped them working, though some Huguenots went back. They would try and say that the persecution was exaggerated.
And we know, of course, that Charles II, in his declaration of war, when he joined with Louis XIV, he would cite Romain de Hoge's, it's not atrocities, but the print that they made of the celebrations of the Peace of Breda. They were hugely offended by that, the English, and they cited in their war declaration. So it kind of shows how representation and I think anger and reputation comes up again and again.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I think we could have one or two maybe, but lunch is waiting in the castle. No, so it's up to you. No questions? Okay, then we are in the end of the morning program. Thank you very much, Ms. Lamau, for your lecture, and Mr. Mensel. Thank you very much. I think